Welcome to the survey results webinar for the metro areas of New York City, Atlanta, Raleigh, and Pittsburgh. I'm Carissa Tastian, Director of Programs at Digitunity, and I'm joined by some of my Digitunity colleagues. Digitunity's mission is to eliminate the technology gap through and with a network of stakeholders and solutions so that everyone can thrive in a digitally connected society. We're an independent, national scale nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing digital equity through device ownership. We're glad to have all of you here from these metro areas and some guests with us today as well. In the next hour, we'll be hearing from Dr. Amanda Beacom, Vice President of Research and Data Science at Visible Network Labs. Over the last several months, Digitunity has worked with Dr. Beacom and her team to design and deploy a survey in 10 metro areas that are part of our pilot program to address the homework gap and specifically looking at sustainable device ecosystems. As believers in taking a collective approach to digital equity, we undertook this effort to gain insight into what organizations in these metro areas are engaged or want to be engaged in digital equity efforts, and to better understand the organization's interactions, their quality, their power, the trust and value, all things that make collaboration work. Our goal is to offer a tool for insight that will likely complement your efforts and hopefully provide knowledge and connections that lead to benefits for community members. After this webinar, if you participated in the survey, you'll receive an organizational profile for your own organization and a highlights report of your metro area. After Dr. Beacom has provided an overview of the results of the survey, we'll provide time for your questions to be answered. Please use the Q&A section rather than chat to pose your questions. I'll close our time together with some reminders and additional next steps. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Beacom with us today.
Thanks, Carissa. Really happy to be here with everyone. Let me go ahead and share some slides that I'm looking forward to talking through with everyone. So as Carissa mentioned, I'm here representing our team at Visible Network Labs that has been collaborating with Digitunity on this project. My colleague who's led all of these this work on this project, Kaylee Baczynski, is also here. And we're really excited to share with all of you the results of the research that we did on New York, Raleigh, Pittsburgh, and Atlanta. Just a brief introduction about Visible Network Labs, which is our company. We're a social enterprise based in Denver, and we aim to help people and organizations and communities use network science to really increase their capacity to do what they're trying to do to make a positive difference in the world and affect social change. And we do that by offering some software tools that leverage network science and also services and trainings related to those tools. Really all aimed to help people build better collaborative strategies in their networks and ecosystems. So let me just jump right into a little bit of background about the survey that we conducted to gather this data. It was launched in May of 2022, and we across social media and to a number of partners in different communities. We're reporting here on the results in 4 cities, but many of you are probably familiar with the fact that this was actually conducted in 10 cities across the US. And we had some key overarching questions that really motivated this project. One was trying to understand the ecosystem of stakeholders engaged in advancing digital equity in these communities. We wanted to understand what were the characteristics of collaborative relationships in the ecosystem, and really how were stakeholders currently working together. We wanted to understand what sorts of programs and practices these stakeholder organizations were engaged in, what populations they were trying to serve, and then finally wanted to understand how they were viewing their success in their community over time, what they felt that the community had been successful with in terms of digital equity, and also what they were hoping to prioritize in the future. So that's what I'm going to share with you all today. Really excited to dig into these results. Um, First, I want to talk about what we found in terms of the populations being served in each of these four communities. So we asked survey respondents to tell us which populations their organizations were trying to serve and address the needs of. And what you see in this graph is that the most common populations being served are at the top in the dark purple bars, and then in the teal or green bars below, you see a number of other populations that are being addressed. Also. So overall, a number of different groups that the ecosystem is trying to serve. And in New York City, most particularly, that's low-income people, young adults, adults. People sort of across the age spectrum, from young adult to adult, people of color, and women. We also had a number of organizations representing teens. Um, and then you see sort of a number of other populations served. Not surprisingly, in New York City, people living in rural areas was not a key target population. Um, but that's what our survey respondents had to say about populations being served in the New York ecosystem. If we take a look then at Raleigh, we see that the top populations being served, according to survey respondents, were adults, older adults, and young adults, so all across the age spectrum, low income people, and people of color. In Pittsburgh, it was children, those in early childhood, teens, young adults, adults, and older adults. Again, really everyone across the age spectrum in Pittsburgh. And then in Atlanta, we have teens, young adults, low income people, people of color, people with disabilities, and women. But again, in all of these cities, a really broad range of different populations whose digital equity needs are trying to be addressed. I see I have a couple of questions already, and let me just take a look at those. So one of the questions is, are these percentages of respondents or populations organizations wanted to serve? Oh, and you got it. Yeah. So this is actually who they are serving. That's a great question. So this is sort of representing what is actually happening right now in these ecosystems. Then we also, to sort of flesh out the picture of what was going on in these ecosystems, we asked about how stakeholders are currently working together And so we took a look at and asked respondents to identify all of their collaborative partners. And using the answers from that survey question, we created network maps. And these network maps, two of which we see here, are showing the organizations represented as circles. And then the lines between them represent the relationships between each of the organizational partners. We are showing here first the network maps for New York City and Raleigh, and I should add that we're color coding the organizational circles by the type of organization. So yellow is nonprofit, blue is public or government agencies, and orange is private businesses. And so also we're sizing the organizational circles according to how many connections they reported having with one another. Larger circles mean that the organization reported slightly greater numbers of connections than their peers. um, Two very different network maps between New York City and Raleigh. And also, importantly, note that we had two very different survey response rates. So in New York City, a really large urban area, of course, we had 45 responses, and in Raleigh, we had 7 responses. And then just to preview also, Pittsburgh and Atlanta. We had 8 responses in Pittsburgh and 14 in Atlanta. Let me just take these network maps one at a time now. So if you're looking at the New York City map, first of all, you'll see that there's a number of connections. And you'll also see that there's sort of these flower-like, or we call them star-like structures in the network. In network science, a star structure is just referring to the fact that there's one really active organization in the center, and then a number of their partners coming out from that central organization. And you'll see there's a couple of these star organizations represented in the network that were really active and reported having a number of connections. But you'll also see that, it's not just these star structures. There are a lot of interconnections between those, and really just a few disconnected subgroups on the outer edges of the network. What I take away from this as an outsider and someone with some network expertise is that there are definitely some really active organizations focused on digital equity in the New York City ecosystem. There's a lot of connections between different subgroups. And then looking at the sort of distribution of colors throughout the network, there's a good representation of both nonprofits and public agencies. And both nonprofits and public agencies are acting as sort of these central hubs or stars in the center of these subgroups. And then there's also a scattering of private organizations. A lot of connections and activity in New York City with some really key hubs. In Raleigh, we had, excuse me, 7 responses, so smaller ecosystem as reflected with the survey responses. Um, but a fully interconnected ecosystem. Everyone has some connection to everyone else. And there is a good representation, as in New York, of both nonprofit and public organizations. No private organizations were listed by the organizations who responded to the survey as partners. That may reflect what's really going on the ground, on the ground, or that may be that the 7 responders just didn't have those partnerships with private businesses. You'll see also in Raleigh, there's a couple of larger circles, meaning some organizations that are really very active in the community ecosystem. And so those organizations are probably pretty important to all of the work that's going on in Raleigh. But lots of collaborative partnerships and connections. Apologies, I have a doggy in the background. And then in Pittsburgh, um, you'll see and probably notice immediately that it's all nonprofit or yellow organizations. There's one particular hub in the middle here that showing a number of different connections with others. And then there's 2 organizations that are not connected to anyone else. Um, that may actually be the case, or again, that may be an artifact or a result of the lower response rate. And then finally, in Atlanta, we have, somewhat like New York, some hubs out from which a number of other organizations have been identified. We have some interconnections between subgroups, but then we also have some subgroups that are not as well connected. Atlanta is dominated by nonprofit organizations with some good representation by public agencies and also a couple of private businesses. So very diverse ecosystems across these 4 communities. And that represents really what we saw in all 10 cities, just really diverse sort of structure going on in each of these communities. Um, One thing that I want to share as sort of for comparison are some networks that Visible Network Labs has worked with in other communities. These are a little bit different from the networks that we mapped in the Digitunity project, in that all of these networks are really well-established formal networks where there's a formal list of members, they have regular meetings that all of the members attend, and they've been working together for a while. Whereas what we were trying to do here with these 4 ecosystems is really just map the ad hoc group of organizations in each community that are working on digital equity efforts. So you'll see the structure is definitely different. There's a lot more members in each of these 3 networks, and there's also a lot more connections or lines between them. But these are really representative of what you tend to see in typical formal community networks that meet regularly together. You'll see this sort of strong core of very active, very connected members of the network. These are often organizations that, in the case of digital equity, probably are really focused on that particular mission and have a lot of programming around it. And then on the periphery of the network map, you have less connected organizations that are probably not focusing exclusively on digital equity work, um, and are important because they're connecting the central core of organizations with likely different communities, different perspectives, and different voices. Uh,
Amanda, I have a
yeah,
question for you. Of the three
sure.
maps, do you recall what the sectors are that are represented? Is it healthcare or their mission there?
Yeah, absolutely. So the community network on the left and on the right, both of these networks are um, really health and social service networks. And I am not going to remember exactly what the different colors represent, but I believe in this network, the sort of hot pink circles represent healthcare non or health related nonprofits. And then here the or there, excuse me, the green organizations also represent health related nonprofits. But then there's also social service organizations in both these networks and foundations and actual medical providers. In the middle network, this is a network that is focused on really advancing equity in the justice system in a particular city, and the organizers of the network are all legal aid organizations or nonprofits, and they're represented by these brown circles. And one of the things they're really trying to do in this network is bring in health and social service organizations so that all of the organizations who are working with sort of a similar, relatively disadvantaged poor population can better coordinate their efforts. So the civil legal aid organizations really wanted to just coordinate better with the health and social service organizations, and you'll see the red circles are the health and social service organizations. They're more on the periphery of the network because it is primarily more of a legal aid network. But they're important, and over time, we would expect them to go more towards the center. One of the reasons I just wanted to share these other network maps with all of you is just really to give you a basis for comparison with the city maps that we looked at around digital equity, and also say that over time, what we tend to see in mature networks is this sort of structure, which we call a core periphery structure, just meaning there's a lot of activity at the core of the network, but then also a number of other organizations on the periphery who are equally important. We looked at a lot of other dimensions of collaboration in the survey. So let me dive into that a little bit more now. The maps are just representing all of the different collaborative relationships, but we asked additional questions about the actual nature of those relationships and what's happening within them. So, one of the things that we asked about was the level of collaborative intensity that was occurring in each of these reported relationships. And we measured this on a 4-point scale where, sort of at the lower levels of collaboration, you might just be aware of one another as partner organizations and aware perhaps of services that are provided or the mission of your partner. And so that's represented over here with this very light green color. And then moving along, a slightly higher level of intensity would be cooperation, where you're informally exchanging information. Maybe you attend the same meetings. You might make referrals to one another. At the coordinated level, you may have started synchronizing one another's activities to try to achieve some mutual benefit. And then finally, at the highest level of collaborative intensity, which we call integration, you may have actual formal relationships and contracts with one another where you're really trying to work together to achieve common goals. And we like to look at collaborative intensity so that we get a better picture of exactly how partners are collaborating. What we see in New York is that a majority of relationships are at this initial awareness level of collaboration, 62% of them. And then we have about 30% at either the cooperative or the coordinated levels, these sort of middle levels of collaborative intensity, and then 9% at the integrated level. In terms of the survey respondents who reported on their relationships, many of them are at this sort of initial stage of collaboration in New York City. When we look at some of the other cities, it's a little bit of a different picture. So in Raleigh, you see that the distribution across the four different levels of collaboration is a little bit more equivalent than it was in New York. You have 26% of relationships at awareness, and then you have about 56 percent at these middle levels and 17% at integration. Um, in Pittsburgh, somewhat like New York, a lot of relationships are at the awareness level within some additional percentages at the other forms of collaboration. And then in Atlanta, about 40% at awareness, 50% at these middle levels, and just 6% at integration. One of the reasons we like to look at collaborative intensity is that if you for example, Pittsburgh and New York, have a lot of relationships at the awareness level, what that might tell you is you're making a good start on collaborating with other organizations and with collaborative partnerships generally in the ecosystem. But in order to really fully capitalize and leverage a collaborative advantage, you may want to start collaborating a little bit more with one another. Um, Similarly, if you have on the other end of the spectrum, a lot of, which is not the case at Pittsburgh, but if, for example, in Pittsburgh, you had, 75% of the relationships at the integrated level, that may mean first, you're probably getting a lot done together, but you may also be at risk of burning out on your collaborative activities together because we know collaboration is really hard work. And so if in Pittsburgh, you want to sustain the network for a long time. You might think about whether having 75% of relationships at the integrated level might put you at risk for sort of burning out over time. So that's why we take a look at collaborative intensity. We also look at relational trust and value in the collaborative relationships that were reported. When we're looking at trust and value, obviously these are complex concepts. And so we try to measure them on three different dimensions each. When we're measuring relational trust, we look at partner reliability. We look at the degree to which you feel your partner and you are working to support a common mission, and you are open to discussion. And then we ask respondents to assess their partners on these three dimensions of trust on a 4-point scale. So the highest score could be a 4, and the lowest score could be a 0. And what we see in New York is that most of the scores here are approaching 3, which is a 3 and above is sort of what we consider to be strong or high scores. Average was 2.7. The highest scores were around openness to discussion. Um, and I'm always looking at the trust scores really as sort of a basis for establishing strong foundation for collaboration. When we look at the value scores, again, we're looking at 3 dimensions of value. We all know that different organizations bring different forms of value to partnerships. So we're looking at power and influence, which is often associated with organizations that have regulatory authority or funding that they can give out. Level of partner involvement in the mission that you're both working on, and the degree to which partners are contributing resources to that mission. And what we see here is that the value scores are a little bit lower than the trust scores for the most part, and on average, the overall value score is an average of 2.3, with the power and influence scores being higher and the resource contribution scores being a little bit lower. Let me show the results for the other 3 cities, and then we'll talk a little bit more about how this data can be useful. In Raleigh, the trust scores were again a little bit higher than the value scores. So again, approaching an average of a 3 for the trust score, with partner reliability being quite high, and then with the value score, a little bit of a lower score, with pretty equivalent scores across the 3 dimension, power and influence again being the highest. In Pittsburgh, a really high trust score. Again, reliability was and openness to discussion were rated quite highly. Um, Value score also high here, especially level of involvement. A little bit different from the Raleigh and New York scores, where power and influence was the highest dimension. Oops. And then for Atlanta, again, really high trust score, a little bit lower value score. Openness to discussion and partner reliability were really high. And then on the value side, level of involvement was again quite high. The reason that we like to measure trust and value in this way is really to see both how the overall network is doing on average across these dimensions and in terms of trust and value globally. Sometimes, if there's a trust dimension of trust that is particularly low, that might be a signal or an indicator that that's something to work on in the ecosystem. Or sometimes if a value score, let's say power and influence, is low, that might just tell the network that they need to identify additional members or partners they can work with that might bring that value to the network. Often if we have a low power and influence score, maybe like at 2.0 or lower, that might indicate that there just aren't a lot of organizations with regulatory authority or funding ability. And that might be something for the ecosystem to try to pursue in order to really leverage what they're trying to achieve. Also, we provide these trust and value scores at the individual organization level. We do this confidentially, so only that particular organization sees their own scores, and that can also be used as a potential useful diagnostic or a way to demonstrate, high trust and the trust that with which they're regarded to funders and stakeholders. I'm going to move on now, and I want to talk a little bit in our remaining time about what sorts of successes survey respondents were seeing in their ecosystems and what were their priorities that they really wanted to focus on going forward. Let's dive into those results. And again, I'm going to start with the New York City results. What we're looking at here are responses to a survey question where we asked respondents to rate a number of different digital equity objectives in terms of how successful they felt their community had been in achieving those objectives. So you see in the text at the left here a number of those different objectives that we asked about. And then these bars are representing the different ratings of success. So blue is very successful, teal or green is somewhat successful, green is sort of ambivalent, neither successful nor unsuccessful. And then in orange and purple, we're getting into unsuccessful ratings. And finally, the gray is representing objectives on which respondents just felt they didn't know. They weren't sure how successful their community had been. Um, and then what we did for each of these also is put a red bar to delineate outcomes where respondents collectively at 50% or more had identified there being success. So in New York City, the outcome that 50% or more of respondents considered to have been very successful or somewhat successful was in identifying the populations experiencing digital inequity. Um, and then we had varying levels of success on these other objectives. Increasing access to devices, internet, skills training, and technical support was also an objective where respondents felt the New York City ecosystem had been relatively successful. Then if you go to the bottom, there was less success seen in terms of committing to long-term solutions to digital equity, engaging the private sector in digital equity efforts, and engaging government in digital equity efforts. Let's take a look at some of the other cities' results. In Raleigh, respondents felt that they were seeing or had seen the most success in increasing, again, access to devices, internet, and skills training, um, and in identifying the populations experiencing digital inequity. So lots of success there. There was less success around addressing digital equity through policy and increasing the capacity of organizations who do work in digital equity. In Pittsburgh, um, We had a number of objectives that respondents felt were successful. Um, so you see the red bars all the way down here. So many uh, objectives where 50% or more of respondents saw success. Again, that was in identifying populations experiencing digital inequity, but also in engaging residents who are directly affected by these issues, engaging philanthropy in the efforts, increasing access to devices, and so forth. So in Pittsburgh, a lot of progress was reported and success was seen. And then finally in Atlanta, um, we actually didn't have any digital equity objectives where respondents at the 50% or more level reported success. But we did have, of course, some objectives that were perceived as being more successful than others. And those are at the top, and they're again increasing access to devices and internet, engaging residents, increasing public awareness, and identifying the populations experiencing digital equity. So, asking this question really allowed us to find out what members of these ecosystems felt were areas of strength currently, and then areas obviously where more growth they hope would happen. We also asked about going forward, what they thought should really be prioritized in each of their ecosystems. And while in the previous question, asking about sort of what the current picture of success looked like, you really got a lot of different responses across the different cities. There was a lot more consensus around future priorities. In New York City, the top three priorities identified were again increasing access to devices, internet, skills training, and other supports for those impacted by digital inequity, committing to long-term solutions rather than those short-term band-aid fixes, and engaging the people who are directly impacted by digital inequity in decision making and problem solving. In Raleigh, the overwhelmingly popular priority for the future was committing to those long-term solutions. In Pittsburgh, it was increasing access to devices and internet and engaging residents who are directly impacted. And then in Atlanta, it was increasing access to devices, identifying populations experiencing inequity, and committing to those long-term solutions. So a lot of consensus across all four cities. And really, if we looked at all of the results for all 10 cities, we would see that same sort of consensus. Um, excuse me. So I think we can take away from these results that really across the country, all of these ecosystems agree on what should be priorities going forward in digital equity work. Um, I'll just wrap up now by talking about, particularly for those of you who participated in the survey and are members of these ecosystems, what are some next steps potentially to take away from these results and think about? And there's sort of two things that we always recommend when thinking about what to do with all of these results. And just very broadly, one of them is to first just do some sense making and process the results together. Make sense of them with your partner organizations. Look at the network maps and see if you think that they're accurate or if maybe they might have been hampered by a poor response rate and that there's some things, some missing pieces to the puzzle that you might want to add. Think about whether there are sectors or types of organizations that are under or overrepresented in the ecosystem and what might be done about that, and how members of the ecosystem are working together, what sorts of resources they can bring to really strengthen the work of the community partners. And then after that sense making step, another step that often folks find useful is to think about, okay, now that we've sort of processed the data and decided, what we think about it, what should we do? What should we do next? And how could some of these results be used to inform strategic planning or goal setting throughout the ecosystem? And so think about what sorts of changes could be made in these ecosystems, especially think about what kinds of changes could be made given the real consensus that we see in these priorities for the future that each city identified, and what changes could be made to the ecosystems to really try to better achieve those common priorities. So some of the things that you can think about as a member of one of these ecosystems is what type of collaboration is happening in the ecosystem. If for example, you're in the New York City ecosystem and you see that the majority of your relationships are at that initial awareness level, you might consider, first of all, if you think that's an accurate picture of your ecosystem, and then if you think it's accurate, you could consider how you might increase the level of collaboration that's happening to really take advantage of the partnerships that were represented in that network map. Um, and so these are just some of the ways that you can think about and use these results. I hope that they are used because always, the sort of worst outcome that could happen from a project that like this is that the results aren't useful for organizations and people in these communities. Um, and I will, with that, pass the floor over to Carissa. If there are any other questions or comments that anyone wanted to make, again, feel free to put those in the Q&A, and we'd love to talk about them with you.
Thank you, Dr. Beacom. So to wrap up for today, and yes, please feel free to add any additional last thoughts. We'll have many opportunities for that, and that's what I'd like to share with you. As we had mentioned, if you had filled out the survey this past summer, you'll receive a highlights report for your city or metro area and a member profile of your organization in the coming days and weeks. We'll also be receiving a feedback survey that we would love for you to reflect on this project and give us some input there. And we'd also like the conversation to continue and driven by the ways in which would be most useful to you. And so we are going to move into regional groupings. And so of the 10 cities, there'll be 4 regional groups. And we'll also be over time inviting states and communities within those regions to join into the group as well. And it will be led by your groups. What how you would like this to develop and what would you like to be discussed. Will be mainly around our area of expertise with Digitunity and focus devices and device ownership. And it's meant to be a place and space for reflection. Let's look at the data a little deeper. What's happening? What can you share? What can you learn? It may become a community of practice, or it may be just meeting quarterly and just catching up with one another. So those meetings will be happening in January, and that's our next slide here with a variety of dates and links. Again, this will all be shared with you in follow-up emails, but maybe I do see a question in here. I'm going to pop in. Yes, you'll be receiving, thank you, Deidre, for your question. You will be receiving a recording of the Zoom webinar that will be coming into your email, and a report available for those who are not in the 10 cities. Yes, not the member profile, because that's specific to an organization, but the highlights reports for the metro areas will be available at some point on our website. So that will be a place to check that information out. Thank you for the question. And thank you all for your participation in today's webinar. We hope that it's been a good use of your time. I would definitely like to thank my colleagues at Digitunity, Lindsay and Sonia, for all their support. And of course, our VNL colleagues, Kaylee and Dr. Beacom, for all their expertise. Thank you, everyone.